Hello and welcome to another episode of Gen Podcast. Today the topic of discussion is social welfare. So we have Umesh Moramudali and Gayani Hurulle with us today to discuss a little bit more about social protection. So I think when we talk about social protection, the first thing that we have to discuss about for anyone who's eager to learn about this is to explain and to know what social welfare is and what are the things that is encompassed in the term social welfare. So I think it's better if we start the discussion by telling a little bit more and explaining social welfare as a concept. Would Gayani? Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are many different terms that are thrown about these days: social protection, social safety net, social assistance, and so on. So just to start with terminology, and then we'll get into what specifically it should encompass, is that social protection is a wide umbrella of terminology, and which really looks at a lot of different things. It looks at social assistance, which is essentially where the state will pay to subsidize or just pay for the benefits of people who are deemed poor or vulnerable from the state's budget. It looks at social, so this includes programs like Samurdhi, which we're very familiar with. There are disability benefits, kidney benefits, and so on. Then you have social insurance programs, which are the pensions, your EPF, ETF, those sort of programs. You have livelihood development programs, which you will see even those days under the Samurdhi program. You would have economic empowerment, those type of programs. You can also consider programs where you look at social services or social care programs where you have, say, orphanages, elder homes being run. So it's essentially the government and honestly other non-state actors as well playing a role to make sure that those who are poor, vulnerable, and basically in need are supported to make sure that their basic needs are taken care of.
I think that pretty much covers.
Okay, so now that we know a little bit more about what social welfare is, can we also discuss now Sri Lanka has been a welfare state since the independence, I think. So from that point, or like in the recent times, what have been the social welfare schemes that have been being implemented in Sri Lanka, and could you tell us how many programs have been there, what are they, and who were the beneficiaries?
Right, so there are many different programs that have been implemented over time, and what we've seen is that different programs have been added over the years. So some came in the 1940s, some in the 60s, 70s, 90s, and so on. Right now, my last count was that there were at least 30 different programs, which has their own benefits. Sometimes it helps to have very targeted programs for a specific need, but of course some of them have their own drawbacks. Many, I think at least 30 are in place. What you'd be most familiar with is the Samurdhi program, which has been in place since 1995, and that was sort of a changing of from the Janasavya program that was in place earlier. So that is one of the flagship programs that has been in place until very recently. It was conceptualized as actually quite a good program, but it has, in its implementation, it ended up being co-opted for political gain, which unfortunately led it to be quite an inefficient program. So Lanija did some research on this national representative survey in between August 2022 and March 2023. And what we found is that the Samurdhi program, there were 1.7 million beneficiaries. So those are families as of last year, I believe. And of the 1.7 million beneficiaries, only 40% were actually below the poverty line. Right? Another thing that we saw in Samurdhi is if you look at the poorest 10% of households, only 31% were actually receiving it. Meanwhile, 4% of the richest 10 households were actually receiving Samurdhi. So you'll see that this is essentially now what we inherited was quite a broken system. And then this was co-opted for political gain. One reason is that income was the eligibility sort of criteria to get on the program. But in practice, different individuals, institutions tended using different eligibility criteria, and then we saw that many even politicians used it to get people on the program. So in doing our research, we even met an individual, a mason in Polonnaruwa, who told that he couldn't get on the Samurdhi program for many years. But after he started attending election rallies and in fact started putting up, flag posts and whatnot at an election rally, he got on the program shortly after. So that itself will show you the design of the program versus implementation, how it failed. So that's just one of the programs. There are many others. Some have their relative merits, but this is one of the programs that has been in the spotlight as necessary for reforms.
No, I mean, to put a little bit of a context to what Gayani says, because she gave a lot of numbers, because there's a lot of discussion why Samurdhi is being eliminated or what's the issue with Samurdhi. As she mentioned, there were a number of issues. I think this all broadly falls under 3 or 4 major areas. One is the inclusion and exclusion errors that Gayani referred to. Some rich people were receiving Samurdhi while their research clearly shows that only 40% of the poor were receiving Samurdhi, because the objective of Samurdhi was to ensure that the poor get some support from the government because they don't have money or it is difficult for them to do a job. So essentially 60% of the poor that were supposed to receive that support was not receiving support as support from the Samurdhi. Right, so then we go back to, okay, that's the inclusion and exclusion errors, and then why, right? That's where the political patronage is coming, where there's a significant political influence in terms of determining who's getting Samurdhi. This has been coming in many different ways. One of the ways is that the local government members were members of the committee that decides who's getting Samurdhi and who's not. And as Gayani mentioned, the income was one of the major criteria, and once you submit an application, it has been assessed by a committee, and that committee has Samurdhi officer, Moramudali, and also the local government member and few others. Right, so realistically the local government member has a significant influence in the process. That's where, as she mentioned, people who cater to the certain political party go on to the rallies, getting into the Samurdhi beneficiary program, right? And then there's also the element of Samurdhi officers, because Samurdhi officers also been politically appointed, right? This is not to say the previous schemes were better. They supported the previous regime, and then Samurdhi just replaced it with their own political affiliations. But the bottom line is, then you have Samurdhi officer who is also a political appointee, and then a significant power is held by the local government official. Then it makes sure that the people who receive Samurdhi are not the ones who are supposed to receive it. And so that sort of manipulates the system. So that's the second one. The third one is, I think, the inefficiencies in the system, because I think Gayani can add the stats, because there's all 16 Moramudali divisions as one Samurdhi bank, and this Samurdhi bank often does not locate in a city, sometimes in a faraway area. Sometimes people have to go in like 2 or 3 buses to get into the Samurdhi bank, and that Samurdhi bank gives you a specific date to come in and collect your payments. You go on that day and then realize that okay, the payment hadn't come in. And most of these people who are receiving Samurdhi are the daily wage earners. So they either have to stop farming, fishing, or doing any other daily wage activities and go and collect the payment. And the moment you go and collect the payment, you're told sometimes, okay, the officers are not here, the money hasn't come in, many different things. So there's a huge transaction cost, and also essential loss of money for those people for whom, even 5,000 rupees is quite a lot of money. And that inefficiency is on top of, all those different ways of harassment. In the sense, I don't mean like different ways of harassment when I say it's difficult to get different approvals and wait in the queue. It's a long process sometimes to get the Samurdhi benefit. So that inefficiency is also one of the big loopholes, right, Gayani? I mean, like the
Absolutely.
I think you had like some interesting findings there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Umesh, for bringing that up. So, even from this survey that we did, we found that on average, a beneficiary would spend 1.5 hours traveling to the Samurdhi Bank and then another 2.5 hours at the Samurdhi Bank. So, that's an average of 4 hours. In fact, there were some people who said that they had spent up to 12 hours at the Samurdhi Bank to collect at that point quite a small sum of money, but of course it is substantial for many families, right? So you see, like Umesh said, the transaction costs are very high, and absolutely like Umesh said, the communication channels absolutely have broken down, but of course it's context dependent. So I remember we went to a certain and spoke to a certain group in Jaffna who said that they used WhatsApp groups to communicate, and they said when the money was ready, they would text the group and say, okay, money is ready, come. But in some other cases, they had a fixed date, and then, there were all these other communication barriers. And again, like Umesh said, people would have to go on multiple days. Once they go there, they have to spend a lot of time there. And again, echoing what Umesh said, what we also heard is that the power dynamics are such that people sometimes felt belittled, where they couldn't even they didn't feel like they were entitled to ask for the process to move faster. People would take very long lunch breaks, and then which would lead to this very inefficient process. So many different elements to build up on to show that there is a clear need to move away from this process.
Yeah, so I think it's very clear that Samurdhi, as a Samurdhi scheme, as a welfare scheme, although has its benefits, also have a lot of drawbacks, and that is probably why we needed a new replacement for the Samurdhi scheme. And I think in that context is where Aswesuma comes in. And again, that Aswesuma as a scheme has also created a lot of social discussion, and the point of whether it is better or than Samurdhi, or is it just better on paper. And like you just discussed, like we just discussed, how when it comes to implementation, there are a lot of variables coming into play, and how it might not be what it is originally envisaged, right? So even though Aswesuma has been implemented for a short time, what are your insights on Aswesuma? What is it? How has it been so far?
Umesh, do you want to go?
I will give context because Gayani has more specific details on that, what they found out. I think I'll clarify why. I mean, now we know that why assess was needed, because to address issues of Samurdhi. So one common question a lot of people would ask is, okay, now there's Aswesuma, does that mean Samurdhi does not exist? From what we have heard, because we are also researchers, we are not speaking for the government or any institution on that regard. So we also speak from the information that we get from them. From what we hear is that the Welfare Benefit Board will carry out the cash transfer payment, which is the money that people usually get as a Samurdhi benefit. That will be handled by the Welfare Benefit Board. That is what is now termed as Aswesuma. So that means, those monthly payments will no longer be handled by the Samurdhi Bank. People no longer have to go to the Samurdhi Bank to collect those payments. That will directly go to a bank account of the recipient. They can go either collect to the ATM or go to the bank and collect it. And so that eliminates Samurdhi Bank from the process of providing money, or rather disseminating the money that is coming from the government. That is handled now by the Welfare Benefit Board and directly going to the banking system. So which makes the process more efficient. So that leaves the question, what's then happened to the Samurdhi? So what we are hearing from the government is that Samurdhi will no longer handle cash payments, but Samurdhi will handle the empowerment aspect of social welfare, because social welfare, also Samurdhi in particular, is not merely about giving cash to the people. It wasn't supposed to be that. The idea of that is you provide certain support during the tough times, and trying to help them, uplift them, providing them a sort of basic support to facilitate the social mobility, right? So that is the idea, to do the empowerment. So the empowerment part is still with the Samurdhi. Of course, we don't know how this is going to be played out. It's quite unclear. As for me, it is quite unclear. I mean, I don't know whether there's more information out there, but I think both of us are on the same page on that, right? So so there's that aspect, and then there are also unclarity about what's going to happen to certain Samurdhi payments. For example, how Samurdhi payments used to work is there were certain stuff like compulsory saving, and some amounts were deducted for, in case of a Samurdhi beneficiary having a funeral, or a child getting married, or a childbirth, etc. So they used to get some amounts, and for those there were some deductions, right? So those things also important for them, and it's not quite clear how that's also going to play out. But what is clear is you are not getting both. You're only getting Aswesuma as your cash transfer. Samurdhi is, I think they're planning to have it there as the empowerment side of it, right? So that's my idea.
That is also my understanding. But of course, like Umesh said, we don't have full clarity on what is going on with government. This is what we are hearing from various discussions and what's available in the public domain. But yes, there are some questions on how it will link to the compulsory savings and the loans. All of that is unclear, because ideally, if they are being handled by two different agencies, then you need the databases to be combined and the two agencies to work together in tandem to a certain extent. Again, we don't have a lot of clarity on how or if or how that's going to happen. So yes, just adding to what Umesh said, the fact that we are trying to move away from the Samurdhi banks towards regulated banks, because Samurdhi banks, despite their name, were actually just government collection points. They weren't regulated by the central banks. So going towards regulated agencies is always a step in the right direction. One thing, though, that I'd like to mention is that as far as I'm aware, the benefits are only being dispersed through government banks. It hasn't been pushed out to private banks yet. So ideally, if it was pushed out to private banks also, then the number of collection points would further increase, which would then be more convenient to people, right? So again, you may be dealing with a more limited set of collection points once again. Something else that I heard is that government was trying to regulate the Samurdhi banks, bring it under the wing of the central bank, I believe as a microfinance institution, and then allow for disbursement through the Samurdhi banks as well. In my opinion, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because once they're regulated and then they're brought back into the system, then again that will further increase the number of collection points. So from a pure transaction cost perspective, that seems like a good way to go just for convenience of people. But of course, you need to make sure that they are digitalized well. All these other facilities that are available at other banks are also available at those, to make it a fair sort of a good experience for people when they go to collect their benefits. The other thing that I'd like to talk about in terms of Aswesuma is that they are trying to make an effort to use data to actually verify who's in need of benefits. So something that we spoke about earlier in the context of Samurdhi is that they used income or expenditure as a means of selecting who should come into the program, but that's very difficult to verify, because in Sri Lanka we have a lot of seasonal variation, you have a lot of informal work, so it's very difficult to identify what people's income and expenditure are, unlike in developed countries where this is all sort of there on record, right? So this is why in a lot of developing countries, and Sri Lanka is not the only one, in a whole array of developing countries, you tend to use this thing called proxy means test, where you look at what kind of your assets you own, what kind of house you live in, and a bunch of other indicators as a proxy to see whether or not you need benefits. Now, there are various pros and cons of this, which I will not get into because we could spend hours talking about it. But just in principle, my view is that it's a step in the right direction, because we've seen a system where the lack of verifiable data has meant that the entire system has been co-opted by various different parties, and there have been various perverse incentives. So to the extent possible that we can use data to actually see who is providing correct information and verify that is a step in the right direction. It's not going to be perfect by any means, and this is why this appeals process, which has also been built into the system, is so essential. We don't have a lot of visibility in how the appeals process is going to work beyond the rules that have been published by the government, I believe in October 2022, which says that there's going to be a 5-member committee, including representatives from the divisional secretariat, 2 representatives from the district secretariat, and 2 representatives from like a non-governmental community who will be a part of that committee. But beyond that, we honestly don't have a lot of visibility into how it's going to be carried out. I believe the appeals process is being, they're working on sorting through the appeals right now, so it's only later that the final list of beneficiaries will be put out. But what you will see is that it is a more systematic process with more checks and balances than Samurdhi, and that is at least on paper quite encouraging.
I think the Gayani, there's also that aspect, the limited room for political influence, right? Because earlier you could see the Samurdhi officer could decide whether this person is getting or not, and the local government politician can decide. Now you have to entirely rely on data, so there's a lot more, you don't have to go and beg your political, your local government politician or the Samurdhi officer, right, which was the case before. I think that's, as you said, that's good. But there's also, there's a lot of room for improvements.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that we've seen in talking to people, in doing qualitative research, is understanding that there are quite a lot of information gaps, because on ground, to their credit, you've seen that government has tried to communicate to people through a variety of channels, even to tell to register for programs. I remember SMSs coming, it was in the media, all that. But what we saw when we went to the field is people rely on relationships, pre-existing relationships with government officers to really understand what to do. They need they're used to having the government officers say, this is what you need to do. And when there are information asymmetries, and when the message gets diluted and changed as it goes from officer to officer, then you find that there are the message that people actually get at the end is actually quite different. And we've seen this even in the appeals process. We've seen this in the context of people's understanding or perceptions on how long they're getting benefits for. Because something that we saw again in this process is that according to the gazettes put out by government, the beneficiaries, and this is also something quite important to mention, the beneficiaries have been grouped into 4 groups, right? So they are getting different amounts. So they've been called transitional poor, vulnerable poor, and severely poor. And there's a certain group, say the transitional poor will get 2,500 rupees, and they will only get that for 6 months. Then the vulnerable group, I believe, gets 5,000 for 9 months. And then the poor and the severely poor both get benefits for 3 years, but for 8,000 rupees and 15,000 rupees.
8,500, I think, right?
5,000 is for the
8,500.
8,500,
Yeah.
perhaps 8,500.
That's
the poor.
poor. Severely poor gets
Poor is 15,000.
15,000.
Yes, that's correct. But of course, now this is what's in the Gazette. One is that we've heard people's understanding of what they have said as 6 months being 3 months, what is supposed to be 3 years being understood as 6 months. So there's quite a lot of confusion about that. And honestly, even as a researcher who has been working on this area, what is sort of unclear to me is how people are actually going to be moved out of this process. Are they going to do a reassessment in 6, 9 months and 3 years to actually see, okay, do they no longer fulfill this criteria before they're taken out of the scheme? What are the indicators that are going to be checked before they're taken out? So there are many questions, even as researchers, I certainly have. And we're, of course, looking to see whether they're going to be answered. But yeah, generally...
I think that's also where the statistics department comes in, right? I mean, they are not really happy with sharing data in most cases. But I mean, one of the questions that I have is like, so are they going to conduct a similar the exact same survey again,
Exactly.
and then do the reassessment of the people, and then decide, okay, we are going to remove you.
Exactly.
So that data collection part again, are you again going to do the data collection? Is the after 3 months, is it decided based on data collection, or is it decided based on something else? That part for me also not clear.
Exactly. And honestly, going back to first principles of the specific indicators that are also used, my hunch, and I mean, we can again go into more detail here, is that I don't think that many of the particular indicators that have been chosen are ones that change, quite frequently over time. So like the type of house you live in, the nature of housing, the square footage of your house, and so on. That is, my sense is that it's a sign of long-term poverty, and that's not going to fluctuate a lot. So that's also one of the drawbacks that need to be thought about in terms of how you structure different types of programs and what indicators you use for each of those.
Yeah, I mean, then I think, are you again going back to income to determine whether they are eligibility or not, right?
Exactly.
Because that is like one thing that might change. That also again, self-reporting.
Exactly. So I mean, these are just very difficult questions.
Exactly.
I understand why you use the proxies, but at the same time, you also deal with these more fundamental issues of what's a good indicator. But
yeah, I think this is where we can insist the role of the statistics department enough to say, because the success of this program largely around two things, right? One is the quality of the data you collect. So that really depends on how the questionnaire is designed, how you collect data, how you store data, the transparency of the data, how the data is analyzed, and how the indicators are weighted, and then you arrived at the deprivation score, whatever the criteria that you use. And then the capacity of the welfare benefit board or the statistics department and whatever other government agencies to implement this, do all that. I genuinely have concerns about that. I don't know whether you have also come across any, because for me, as we discussed, we don't know, okay, now how this further data collection is going to happen, and we don't see the data being made public either, at least, saying, okay, this number of people, we know the very basic numbers, this many applied and this many rejected, but that's all we have, right? Even for us to, as researchers, to do an assessment, I think in other countries I see the data has been more transparent.
Right, yeah.
So I do have two questions out of the discussion that we had just before, comparing and looking at analyzing the two social protection schemes. And so first one is the extent of the government involvement. So we know who's implementing, which line ministry or ministries are actually responsible for it. And Umesh was also talking about the role of someone who's not necessarily implementing the program, but is crucial in order to get the beneficiaries right, data right, everything. So what is the extent of the government's involvement in these schemes?
I think you can that.
Yeah, so just so that I can understand, the question is, where has the government got involved at various stages of this, right?
Yes.
So like Umesh said, here the Welfare Benefits Board is the agency that is really key for the Aswesuma program. I think by law they have two functions. One is to identify the beneficiaries and then also ensure the delivery, right? So they are really the key agency over there. But like Umesh mentioned, there are the Department of Census and Statistics. I'm sure Ministry of Finance just broadly plays a role in allocating money. Various other agencies also play a supporting role. And then, of course, the link to the Ministry of, I believe, Women and Child Affairs and Economic Empowerment will also be crucial because of the link to the Samurdhi program. And then, of course, at various other levels of provincial and local government, they will have to get involved at an implementation level, which is where the divisional secretariats, district secretariats, and so on will come in. So it's a sort of multi-layered, multifaceted sort of approach, but right now the WBB is the most central agency.
This is important because one of the reasons why WBB had to be established was because the social protection system, or rather the social the social safety net, has been fragmented, right? So there was Samurdhi giving the Samurdhi benefits, then there's elderly secretariat providing elderly allowance, the disability secretariat providing disability allowance. I think the health ministry or something provided the kidney disease allowance. So there were very many different agencies providing. So that duplicates the process, that complicates the process. So that's why everything had to be brought into one. Then you decide, okay, who's going to get what and at what price. So you can bring all that data into one place, right? I think because they have the welfare, what do you call the integrated data?
The integrated welfare management system.
Management system. So they at least they have digitized the data
exactly,
which wasn't the case before. Now the welfare benefit board has all the data at one place. Yeah, they can actually track who had requested what not. So that's like one of the aims of doing it, and to centralize that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because one of the big portion of the reform process has been the establishment of this particular database, because until then everything was operating in silos. So now you can see, okay, if your family is getting Samurdhi, this centralized agency can also see whether they are getting disability benefits and whatnot. So that's very helpful. I think right now it is 4 schemes that has been brought under this particular database for now, or that's at least the focus of the Aswesuma program. But in time, I believe the hope is to bring all the other social assistance programs under this registry.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully that will be
one
done,
hopes.
right?
One other point that I wanted to raise and clarify on is that we also spoke about how Samurdhi is going to take charge of the empowerment, social empowerment element of it. And I would like to know the social welfare schemes in general, say in the past decade and the upcoming ones. What is the social empowerment element in it, and has it been have you observed a social empowerment from and through the schemes?
So I suppose we can talk historically. The Samurdhi program itself had several different elements. So one of them was providing loans at a subsidized rate. Though the rate, of course, when we spoke to people, they weren't even sure what the rate was, but there was the provision of loans, especially because you hear that they couldn't get access to finance through normal commercial entities, so they did rely on these
more
loans.
than the rates. I think the key was they didn't have access to the banks and giving money, so that's
exactly. So that has been, I think, one component of the empowerment initiative, in which you can get access to finance so that you can set up your own micro enterprise or whatnot. And the other has been a livelihood training program, in which they actually provide you the necessary skills. My sense, again very anecdotally, is that this has, at least the livelihood development program, has not been done in a super centralized and planned way, because what we heard again from people, I don't have a good sense of how it happened from the sort of government planning side, but we heard people saying, yes, there were batik workshops, there were cake workshops and whatnot that were carried out at their own village level, but then at the same time people had no interest. They didn't have access to get the right equipment, so therefore the entire program didn't work. So maybe one thing to think about in the future is, and it's no easy task, but even when coming up with the livelihood training programs, the concept of trying to plan sort of centrally and see what are the key skills gaps that you need to try bridge, and then see how you can bring it into the livelihood training programs. That's one. Something that we've seen working quite well in the cases of countries like Bangladesh is, again, building on this loan initiative, because you see that they worked quite a lot with private sector players as well. They brought in the not-for-profit, the sort of other communities as well who are doing this, and they worked in collaboration, which really helped the government programs to work quite well as well. So yeah, I hope that answers that,
Yes.
at least part of your question.
So one final question before we wrap up the discussion is again something that is being discussed, and I think a lot of misconceptions are also there around the same issue, is whether as a result of the IMF agreements that the state of Sri Lanka has with the IMF, is there any affectation to the social welfare scheme? Have they suffered a cut? Or like what is the situation with regard to the IMF and its affectation to social welfare?
IMF hadn't asked Sri Lanka to cut social welfare. In fact, IMF has imposed a floor. That is to say that IMF has said Sri Lankan government has to spend minimum this much amount of money on social welfare. So there's sort of a condition to say that you need to make sure that you protect the poor and vulnerable, which is when you read the IMF report on Sri Lanka, that's been one of the key highlights that has been put there. So IMF doesn't come and say, look here, cut social welfare. I think this is also part of, so IMF also learning from their mistakes back in the 70s, 80s. There was a lot of criticism against IMF saying IMF don't really care about the poor, they don't understand the poor's issues, etc. I think they have also evolved, and that's why you see in a lot of IMF programs now, they insist that the government spend enough on social protection, rather to overall social protection, which includes social safety nets, health, education, all that. So IMF doesn't really say to cut it, but they say spend this much minimum you have to spend. But of course, as we discussed throughout the podcast, lot riding on how poor and vulnerable get protected, the fact that it is happening, that's lot of that is riding on the implementation, right? And because now we have seen all the laws has been passed, you can allocate money, but how that's going to be implemented will decide or determine how successful it will be.
So I think with that we can wrap up the discussion. But before we wrap up, if there is a last thought, that's something that you want to highlight, perhaps the two of you can.
And I'll say like quickly to say, okay, the reforming social safety net is essential, because as Gayani highlighted, with data, because it is important to put data into perspective to understand how bad the issues were. The previous social safety net system was bad, and it really needed reforms. Just there are issues in the way Aswesuma is carried out. It's not a perfect system, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done. So I think I want to emphasize that point, that the reforms are needed. It's a learning curve. It's not a perfect system at the start. I think it's important that acknowledge that there are issues, but move forward and try to fix the issues, rather than, hey, we are abolishing this, we are going back to Samurdhi all over again, and we are giving everyone who's asking Samurdhi, just like what we used to do. That is precisely what we shouldn't do, is my last thought.
Yeah, that's a great point. And what we saw in our national survey last year and this year, honestly, is that before COVID, there were 3 million poor people in Sri Lanka. This has increased by 4 million to a point that there are 7 million people living in poverty in Sri Lanka. So the need for social safety net reform, like Umesh mentioned, is so crucial because it impacts such a large part of our population. And there's almost a moral push right now to make sure that they are protected at this point in time. So that's what's very crucial right now. So like Umesh mentioned, we need to make incremental steps. The first round of this reform process, even if it is implemented by the book, may have some challenges. We need to make sure that we learn from the drawbacks that we saw, the challenges that people faced, and continually focus on improving the program. I am particularly keen to see the extent to which we can bring in digital and data to improve the efficiency of the program. We are so far behind many of our peer countries. You look at Latin America, for example, they use various types of technologies to help deliver social protection to the poor. And we also need to keep learning from our benchmark countries, from peer countries, and then work towards improving this process to help the poor and vulnerable communities.
Thank you both for that most insightful discussion. And I think all of us learned quite a lot and got answers to many of the questions that we had with regard to the topic of social welfare. So with that, we wrap up our discussion today. Thank you everyone for joining us. Stay tuned for the next Gen podcast. Thank you.